Wonderful. How about some more love for our music ministry? Amen. Thank you. Good morning. Feeling good? Yes. Got your shopping done? Yes. All right. Well, there's baked goods in the back, so you can. It'll be fresh in a few days, so everybody wins. Amen? So just don't touch the chocolate cake. Just leave that alone. I'll take care of it later. All right. Well, we continuing our theme this month here at SLCA has been about looking at some of the different world religious traditions in what I would call what I've been calling a New Thought Advent season. Advent is the traditional Christian journey into the light of Christmas, into the birth of Christ, looking at various principles and elements of light and the journey of faith in Advent. And we have given a twist to that this year to begin in the beginning of December to look at the Buddhist tradition of the Day of Enlightenment. What does it mean, as the Buddha did, to sit in meditation and to attain that enlightened state and realize that all suffering comes from attachment, that attachment can be released, and that we can attain enlightenment as we do that. We looked at the solstice and the tradition of moving into the dark and to really take time to embrace the dark and to look at the various elements of the Christian tradition. And today we look at Hanukkah. And what's interesting about this month is it all kind of collapses into this weekend. Have you noticed the calendar? This is actually the solstice, but we did our ceremony on Wednesday. This is the solstice time over this weekend. It is the beginning of Hanukkah, and we're right on the cusp of the Western world's view of Christmas. You know, our Orthodox Christian friends think we're a little foolish. They do Christmas a little bit later in January, actually, not following the December 25th pattern. So today, as we look at Hanukkah and the Festival of Lights, Joy's done such a beautiful job of giving us just the briefest introduction of what that means. And one of the things that, as we speak about that, I want to talk about what does it mean to be in a place metaphysically or energetically or mentally where we feel as if there is only so much oil. There's only so much blessing. There's only so much gift that we have. And what happens when we feel like that which we have, I have to back up just a little bit because you notice it doesn't happen for other folks up here. We still have to move the speakers with our new stage set, but I've been told that I'm so tall that, and of course my mic is out front rather than, anyway, I'll just back up a little bit so it doesn't annoy you too much. Okay, is that better? All right. So what does it mean when we feel like we've only got just a little, and then something called grace, something called a miracle, something whatever we might call it, and how do we produce the energy of that space where we end up discovering that we are more than what we think we are, right? That's the beauty of the season. So Hanukkah has been often misinterpreted as and dismissed as a minor celebration. In the Jewish tradition, there's a lot more emphasis put on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement and Forgiveness, and the celebration of the Jewish New Year. But of course, Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Torah. It's something that took place long after those times and was written about later for other reasons. But it is not minor because what it signifies, as I said, is that remembrance that we are more than we think we are. And I don't know about you, but that's a message that is eternal and something that we need right now. Of course, we've heard already in the service that the temple was occupied by an invading army, an invading group that had desecrated the temple, had pushed the Maccabees out, and had oppressed them such that they could not pray their prayers, could not practice their tradition, and that small army fought back and fought back and fought back until they reacquired access to the temple. Their desire was to rededicate that temple, to light the lamp and to rededicate it in their tradition, to make it sacred again. They discovered as has been told, that there was only enough oil for that one day, but something miraculous happened. It was the Talmudic rabbis who established Hanukkah many years later, and there was more than just the flesh and blood soldiers who they had defeated that was what the story that they wanted to tell. It was actually the invasion of a worldview, the invasion of what they would have called at that time Hellenistic ideas, a fundamental part of which was today what we would call materialism. Now, when I say materialism, I don't mean shopping and breathe, relax. I won't admonish you for going to Lenox Mall later. That's not exactly what they meant, although it is today's version, interpretation of what they meant. But the Hellenistic worldview was this worldview that was being imposed on the Maccabees, which was to say that who you are amounts only to the materialism of who you are, your body. The Greek worldview was that we were simply our bodies, our possessions, our gold, and that we would do ceremonies and pray to God so that we could take all that stuff with us, because the emphasis on who we were was in that, in what we had and who we were. In other words, there was no soul. There was no spirit. There was no something greater that extends beyond the physical self to say who we were and what we were capable of. And so this, more than anything, really underneath the surface from a metaphysical standpoint, is what Hanukkah is to remind us of. And I will show you how the symbolism of that does that in just a moment. And not unlike the stories that we hear from Christian traditions and from other religious traditions, the fighting of oppression and political and religious forces that have corrupted each other, religious and political forces that have corrupted each other and demonized those who stand in their way. On Wednesday night during our solstice ceremony and candle lighting, I talked about the power of the song, O Come, Emmanuel, and the beauty of those lyrics that says, ransom us captive, Israel. Save us, metaphysically, or even in a very physical, real way. It says, save us from this darkness, from this plight, from this dismal day that we find ourselves in. A song and a season that we are in that is meant to transport the soul to a time when the people of Israel were wandering through the deserts in Egypt without food or water, stricken by disease, made to be slaves, to conform to a society and a culture that opposed who they are. We're meant to feel the weight and the anguish of their exile. We're meant to feel the powerful longing for someone or for something to rescue them. That particular hymn, among others, calls us into radical solidarity with oppressed people, not just from the biblical stories, but real oppressed people in our world who are in the midst of similar oppression, seeking and searching for a better life. For me, this is part of what the season every year is meant to do, to take time to remember those who are seeking and searching for a better life. And perhaps in some ways there is some part of our own selves, of those of us gathered in this space this morning, who might identify with that energy. A song and a season that is meant to capture the lost and longing hope of a people who found themselves in dark times, not just seasonally, but historically. The historicalness of the darkness that surrounded them, if I could speak to it for just a moment, perhaps you'll see some relevance in it. I'm not sure. Let's just try. But what we have are stories over and over again in the Torah and in the Christian tradition of people who found themselves in the long, dark shadows of unprecedented political corruption. In the dark shadow of the demonization and unjust persecution of the other, and in the dark, suppressive shadows of mass manipulation of people via a calculated and deliberate narrative that kept people in the dark. I know, it's just a bunch of old biblical stuff. ancient old stories that we wonder, why do we have to gather and tell these stories again? But anytime we have stories of oil, we should remember that these are stories about our connection to the spiritual realm. They are stories about our consciousness. Because oil is a symbol, right? Oil is a medium of something, right? When you get a massage therapist uses the oil as that medium for the lubrication and for the friction, for the smoothness into the relaxing of the muscles. The oil comes from a seemingly invisible place. You look at an olive, you don't see oil. You got to do something to it to get the oil out. When you light the oil, you get something else that you didn't see when you looked at the oil. You get light. And so it's a medium. It's a place of transmission, transmutation, transformation. So anytime there's a story about oil, it is a story about our connection to the spiritual realm and our consciousness. How do we use our consciousness and our connection to spirit? I'm reminded of a similar story in the Gospels, or actually in the Book of Kings. It's a similar story. That's the story of a widow called the widow and the oil. If you know the story is of a woman who recently becomes a widow and is concerned about the debt that her husband has left, and that she doesn't have enough resources to pay for the debt, and she knows that the collectors will come. And so she's concerned, and so she goes to the priests in her village, and she asks what to do. And when she's there, she says, I don't have, and the priest asks her, well, what do you have? And she says, I don't have anything. And then she pauses in the next line in the story. It says, well, I have just this little bit of oil. I wonder if you can identify with that state of being where you have felt like you've had nothing. But the truth was, if you dug a little bit deeper, you had something. It might not have felt significant. It might not have felt like it's enough. It might not have felt like it was going to do the job. It wasn't going to last a week or a day or whatever the time period was. But it was, in fact, all that you had. And perhaps you were gripped with the sense that it wasn't enough. Have you ever been there? And the Pharisee says to her, take that little bit of oil, now go back to your village and collect as many jars as you can. Get them from your neighbors and from your friends and wherever you can. She sends her sons out, and her sons collect as many jars as they can. And he says, now take them into your home, lock the door behind you, and begin to pour the oil out into those jars. And so she does as she's instructed, and as she's pouring, the oil keeps coming, and the oil keeps coming, and the oil keeps coming. And she fills all of the jars that she has gathered, and the oil does not stop until she notices that she doesn't have any more jars. The jars, metaphysically in the New Thought context, represent our mental equivalents. What is it that we pour our spirit into? What is it that we pour our thoughts or ideas into? What is the container? The container is your thoughts. How do you think about your circumstances? And the spirit that you have, you pour yourself into that, but you can't pour the spirit of possibility into a thought that you're not holding it. If you don't have the thought to hold what's possible for your life, then the spirit can't fill that container. So then that particular story, the story is about increasing our mental capacity, our consciousness of a mental equivalence, that I create the space in my mentality for more than enough, and then pour what I have into that, regardless of how small I think that might be. Similarly, and the story of Hanukkah is a story in which they decide and notice that they only have oil for one day. But when the authors of the story say that that oil lasts for 8 days, it is a symbol, as Joy recognized, that it would take 7 days to either make more oil or to go and to get the oil and to come back. But there's another symbol in that, so there's a practicality to the story. The oil lasts longer than it takes to make or to acquire more oil. But there's another symbol in the story which says that the original candelabras in the temples were of seven places for candles for the 7 days of creation. But if the oil lasted an 8th day, you see, then it is a symbol to those presence of that Hellenistic consciousness that says you are simply the sum total of your materialism. You are the sum total of your conditions in your life. You're the sum total of what has been created in your circumstances. But the story says, no, the oil lasts longer than even the days of creation. A symbol that says you are more than your creation. You are more than creation itself. There's something eternal about you. But we don't have to go. These stories are always telling us that we are more than what we think we are. But we don't have to go to far ancient stories to be in the presence of darkness in our world. Last night and even tonight, children at our border will sleep in cages separated from their families. Homelessness is a tide that is rising in every major U.S. city. Climate change is real, and discrimination and unconscious bias still lurks in the nooks and crannies of our political and policies and institutions. Our nation, in case you haven't noticed, remains hopelessly gridlocked in political spite and dysfunction. Our democracy, it would seem, is no longer guided by facts and reason or moral values and standards, but by persuasive narratives driven by fear and the desperate grasp for dominance by an old white patriarchal class that can't see itself in the future, which is multicultural, multi-generational, gender fluid, loving, respectful, multi-religious body that is the unavoidable outcome of our growing global consciousness. You and I are called to be light bearers in these dark times. But we have to remember, as I said Wednesday night, candles don't light themselves. It's easy to get lost in the dark. It's natural to be frightened in the midst of a storm. And even more frightening than those conditions that I've mentioned and the ones that I haven't mentioned, perhaps even more frightening, is how easy it is to become cynical, disenchanted, and disconnected from it all, to unplug and become apathetic to the work that lies ahead. After all, you've probably realized that your impassioned Facebook posts have not really changed anybody's mind. You've probably noticed that politicians have claimed that they will vote the way they choose, regardless of facts or evidence presented to them, or the sway of people that they claim to represent. So what's the use? It's in these times that we need to remember that candles don't light themselves. We do that. And it's a daily choice that we make. There was a story recently right here in Atlanta. You've probably seen or heard of some aspect of it on the news. It's a story of a mother by the name of Diana, a mother of 4 who felt hopeless and out of options, forgotten by a system that let her drop through the cracks with nowhere to turn. She dropped off her 14-year-old, nonverbal, Down syndrome, and malnourished son off at what she felt was the last vestige of hope, Grady Hospital. Unceremoniously and without word or notification, she vanished. And like so many, I was horrified, confused, even overwhelmed at the heaviness of this story. When we think that we have nothing left, the universe begins to prepare to show us just how connected we are. How many people know that that's true? Yes? And so, when we have just a little bit of oil, the mother was tracked down by the police, living in a hotel with her 3 other children, and was charged with first-degree child endangerment. All of her children taken into custody, and she was sent to jail to await her hearing. But even when we feel that we have nothing left, that there is just a little bit of oil, if you're breathing, you've got a little bit of oil left in you. Go ahead and touch somebody next to you and say, if you're breathing, you've got a little bit of oil left in you. If you're breathing, you've got a little bit of oil left in you. Because what happened, like in the temple when the oil lasted longer than it should, and like the woman, the widow with the jars, when she began pouring that oil, what happened was when this mother arrived to court, she didn't realize when she walked in and saw the courtroom packed with hundreds of people that they had arrived for her. They were mothers of children with Down syndrome who had gathered together, collected enough money for her bail. The DA that showed up drove from an hour and a half away outside of Atlanta to be her defense attorney pro bono, a father of 3 adopted children with Down syndrome. She had no idea. When the judge said, "Where will you stay if I release you?" For the mothers had already raised enough money to pay for the bail. One of the mothers rose to her feet, a mother who had been in a similar situation and had also dropped her son off years ago, but had since been reunited and had a transformation in her life. This mother rose to her feet and said, "She will stay with me because we are family now. Her and all of her children will stay with me." You see, candles don't light themselves. We do that for each other. We can focus on the dark, or we can remember that we have a candle to light. When the oil lasted for 8 days, it was a symbol that said it lasted long enough to make more oil, but also longer than the days of creation, because who we are is more than our material selves. Ernest Holmes says in The Science of Mind, if we could come to the universal wholeness, we must approach it through the law of its own nature. This perception is always an inner light, for the individual can use only as such knowledge as he inwardly possesses. So it is for us to come from that inward place, that knowledge of wholeness, that knowledge of light, that knowledge that says that even despite my circumstances, I have this much to give, I have this much to show up to today, and I place my faith in that it is enough. Why? Because I'm not here alone. Anyone in this congregation or hearing this message throughout this week who feels like you're going through life with something alone, isolated, disconnected, I often say if you were meant to do it alone, you would be the only one here. But look around. You notice that you're not the only one here. You notice that there are people around you. You notice that you have community. I believe that the light that we carry can change the world. I believe that the light that we carry can change the world. There's an old story from one of Robert Fulgrim's books in which he talks about being in school, in college, and asking, the professor had asked at the end of class, were there any more questions? And he raised his hand and he said, "What is the meaning of life?" Everybody laughed and the students began to stand up and walk out of class. And the professor raised his hand and he said, "Everybody sit down. I want to answer the question." And the professor told a story about how he had grown up in a war-torn area of World War I and in Germany, and outside on the trail he would walk by his house, there was a broken World War I motorcycle, and that the rear view, the side mirror of that motorcycle was broken, and he walked over to it one day and he tried to gather all of the pieces of the broken mirror, and he tried to put them, he found the casing from the motorcycle, and he tried to begin to piece them all back in there. And he would do this every day and scrounge around the dirt and try to find another little piece and put it in there. And he noticed that he could never put all of the pieces back. So he took the largest piece that he could, and he noticed that if he scraped it gently on a rock, he could smooth the sharp edges of that mirror. So he did this over and over again until he had actually created a nice little round piece of mirror. And he used that. He kept it in his pocket, and he would play with it. Go to trees and to dark little places with rocks, and he'd catch the light just so and shine the light into those places. And that day, as the students had sat listening to this story, the professor reached into his wallet, pulled out that small piece of mirror, and showed it to the students and said, this is the meaning of life. To take what we have, that life may break us, and remember that we could never put all of the pieces back together again. But what we can do is take what we have and shine it into the dark places. And so I believe that as a spiritual community, as we end this year and prepare for the next year, you've seen the theme of Holy Shift. I believe that something big is happening for us as a spiritual community. I believe that both as individuals and as a community, there are patterns that we have come together to break. I believe that there are shifts that we are here to usher into the world. I believe that anybody that finds themselves in the orbit of this spiritual community can break patterns of addiction, of pain, of self-sabotage, of worry, of doubt, of failed relationships or finances, and that wherever we find that pattern that appears over and over and over again, that we can take what we have, shine a light into that place. As a community, light a candle for each other and remember who we are, and that we can replace those patterns with faith and wholeness and an at-one-ment with a power that is greater than we are, and that we can consciously and constructively use that every day to bring more light, more liberation, more peace and justice into the world. And so I invite us to grow together in that space. I invite the practitioners to rise with me now, to join me in prayer and consciousness. And I invite you to take a deep breath. Divine Spirit, Mother, Father, God, the light of the solstice, the miracle of the oil, the divine presence in each and every one of us. Abba, Alpha and Omega, the infinite, eternal energy of the universe. I know that I am one with this dynamic presence known by many names, but in truth is only one. There's one light, one source, one undivided substance of joy and wholeness and love. And it is seeking to reveal itself in, through, and as me, in, through, and as you, and in, through, and as all life and all creation in this very moment. It is seeking to make itself known as the body temple in health and wholeness. It is seeking to make itself known as the cells of the body that know exactly what to do to bring forward greater wholeness and greater peace and greater joy, greater alignment, greater assimilation and elimination of everything, such that our temples become a vibration of the living Spirit. I know that this one divine light is seeking to reveal itself as the dynamic vibration of our attitudes and our thoughts, and a vibration of love and connection and hope and charity and compassion for each other and for the world. That there is a divine right place for each and every individual within the sound of my voice, a place of divine right employment, a place of divine right belonging with family and community, a place of being centered in the awareness that you are not here alone. No, you are one with the divine infinite power, and one with God is a majority, and you are surrounded, even in this moment, by a community of caring individuals. Oh, simply let your need be known, and know that the light will be lit, that the candle will be shared, that the oil will pour forth, and greater good will come into your life, into my life, into our life. I know that we are here to break patterns of not enoughness, patterns of dysfunction, patterns of doubt and fear and worry that have lasted far too long. And now is ours to say that there is an oil, and we place that oil in its sacred place, and we know that it lasts more than enough. It pours forward into every action and reaction of our thoughts and attitudes and beliefs. This is the energy of the living Spirit Almighty moving in your life and in mine, and moving in and through and as the life of the Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta, all that it is called to be, all that it is called to do, and the community in which it resides, to bring more peace, love, and justice, wholeness, and the vibration of love into the planet. I know this to be the truth not only for us here, but for every temple, every mosque, every synagogue, every holy and sacred place, and every sacred gathering through this season in which two or more people are gathered together in the name and in the sanctity of that divine life that seeks to lift up and bring more light into the world. I am grateful for the sacred holy traditions of the world and the celebrations that take place. I know that the light that is lit in every place illuminates our collective hearts and minds into a new year, into a new way of being that is truly transformational for all. So for this and so much more, I truly give thanks. I release this word. I call it good and very good, and simply allow it to be. And so it is. Peace and blessings.